Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. This is a very special occasion for us, and we want to thank our friends at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center for hosting this unique town hall brought to you by the Future of Tech Commission. And while let me give you a little background on the Future of Tech Commission. It was put together at the behest of the current White House and FCC to come up with a comprehensive view towards a coordinated tech policy agenda for the United States, looking at both policy and regulatory aspects, the behavior of the industry, and public involvement. So this is the third in a series of town halls we're doing around the country. The first we've done in California. And we're looking at, overall, the commission is looking at 5 separate issues, which start with digital equity and access and broadband issues. They include innovation in the social sector on issues like education and healthcare, also market competition and antitrust issues, privacy issues, and finally, the subject of today's town hall, which is platform responsibility and a specific focus on protecting our democracy as it is under assault from various different angles these days. I have 2 co-chairs of the commission, Secretary Margaret Spellings, the former education secretary and chief domestic policy advisor under George W. Bush. She hosted our Texas town hall last week. And our other co-chair, Deval Patrick. Governor Patrick was the 2-term governor of Massachusetts and is now co-chairing this commission with Margaret and myself, and also hosted the initial town hall that we held in Massachusetts. We are welcoming the audience participation today, and as you see, Nate Persily from the Stanford Cyber Policy Center and I are going to moderate what we think is going to be a really, really interesting discussion about platform accountability and responsibility, and the challenges to our democratic norms and institutions that are somewhat unprecedented over the past year. We encourage you to use the Q&A panel throughout the event to submit your questions. We're going to take questions from the audience. We have a pretty incredible audience, actually, who signed up for this event. We'll be posting in the chat a link to our public input form as well, and we'll also share that with the audience at the conclusion of the event. As the commission plays out with a goal of giving the White House and the FCC a broad blueprint for a coordinated tech policy by late summer of this year, we are going to have other ways for you to contribute your thoughts as members of the public or as leading organizations or academics who have points of view on these issues. But it's these series of town halls with public input that we have found have been incredibly helpful to informing the co-chairs of the commission and the commission staff to a broader set of policies. Before Nate and I kick this off, we have limited the amount of the participation of political and elected officials in this particular town hall because we have such an extraordinary panel today. But the Speaker of the California Assembly, Anthony Rendon, who worked very closely with Common Sense Media, of which I'm the founder and CEO, to pass the 2018 California Consumer Privacy Act, and who's been instrumental in some of the important legislation in California regarding the tech community and this golden state. Anthony asked to make some opening remarks. They're about 2 minutes long, and I think they'll set the stage for the conversation that Nate and I are going to moderate. So with no further ado, we'd like to hear very briefly from Speaker Rendon, and then we're going to introduce the panelists and get to our discussion.
Thank you, Jim. I'm honored to be here to welcome the participants to this first California Town Hall for the Future of Tech Commission. I think you all know what you are here for, to help shape policy for technology. In fact, with national and state leaders like the Stanford Cyber Policy Center, the NAACP, and Twitter, it's clear that today's participants have already been working on this issue. Although hothouses of technological innovation have spread across the country, California remains the birthplace of so many important developments. That history and the constant California cutting edge means that this state has to be the role model for the rest of the country. In November, California voters approved an important proposition to enshrine consumer privacy protections in an effort to balance innovation and privacy protection. There is a lot more to do. In recent years, we have seen the power of technology to change our society, both for good and for bad. One positive example: 1 year ago, the technological power of a cell phone camera documented George Floyd's death in a way that made the history of abuses against African Americans visible and obvious to almost every American. But the challenges are also great. How do we curb hate speech and violent extremism while preserving constitutional freedoms? How do you protect human and digital rights in the face of technology that is everywhere? Is it possible to ensure the integrity of information on platforms built on universal access? You are here to tackle these questions of tech accountability. As Speaker of the California State Assembly, I have had two big picture goals. First, I want to make California better for those who have been neglected and disadvantaged in the past. Second, I have worked to democratize the structure and processes of the organization I oversee. I think that's consistent with the tasks you have here in this town hall. I welcome you as you undertake this task. Thank you and good luck.
Hey, thanks a lot, Anthony. And again, we've seen that the state of California has been extremely important in helping to shape important regulations and a broad approach to the technology revolution that we've all lived through for the past couple of decades, and which has brought so much to our society in so many different ways. And I'm proud to say, as a long-time Stanford professor, that Stanford has been at the heart of this revolution. And we're going to have several of Stanford's finest as part of our discussion today, starting with my colleague, Nate Persily, who's the co-director of the Stanford Cyber Policy Center, who's going to co-moderate and lead much of the discussion. Nate came out here from Columbia in 2013. As many of you Stanford folks know, his work focuses on the challenges that the internet and digital technologies pose for our democracy, so perfectly on point for today's discussion. He's written extraordinarily important stuff about how the internet revolution has turned private platforms like Facebook and Google into the primary regulators of campaign advertising and expression. And he is, as I said, the co-founder of the Stanford Cyber Policy Center. So Nate's going to be joining me in a minute to just moderate this whole discussion. We have four very distinguished panelists who I'd like to introduce in order. First of all, Daphne Keller, who's the director at the Cyber Policy Center, at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center, the program on platform regulation. And her work focuses on sort of legal protections for users' free expression when state and private powers intersect. She, until 2015, was Associate General Counsel at Google, and we know the role that Stanford has played in the founding and building of Google. And so Daphne has had extraordinary experience both in the private and public sectors, and she will have a lot to say today in our discussion. She's joined by another colleague from the Stanford Cyber Policy Center, Renee DiResta, who we've worked very closely with at Common Sense Media on some of the most important national security issues related to cyber policy. She is one of the top experts in the United States on disinformation, misinformation, computational propaganda in the context of foreign policy and state-sponsored information warfare. In my latest book, Which Side of History, she had a really terrific essay on QAnon and conspiracy theories and how that has started to infect, if you will, our democratic norms and institutions. So having 2 stars from the Cyber Policy Center in Daphne and Renee is very special. Our third colleague today, Derrick Johnson, is the president of the NAACP, the historic and leading civil rights group for African Americans in the United States. Derrick has been a great friend and colleague of mine at Common Sense. He co-founded the Stop Hate for Profit movement, in which we have focused on the impact of the social media platforms in spreading misinformation, disinformation, racist and hate speech, not just here in the United States, but around the globe. Derrick has been an extraordinary leader in returning the NAA to leadership on multiple civil rights fronts, including on the voting rights front, which we're going to talk about today because of the impact of platform accountability on voting rights. So incredibly happy to have Derrick here today. And finally, our colleague, Nick Pickles. I guess we could call you our token Brit, Nick, but he's actually not just our only UK native, but he's the head of global policy strategy development and partnerships at Twitter. So he's been in the absolute crosshairs of some of the discussions at the intersection of tech, public policy, and politics over the past 7 years. Before he took over all of the public policy responsibilities at Twitter, he ran their public policy efforts in the UK. And he's been a very, very good colleague as we've tried to balance all these key issues. So it's an extraordinary panel. We have an hour of really good discussion that Nate and I are going to lead. I'm going to ask the opening question and then turn it over to Nate, because the opening question is pretty straightforward. And then why don't we start with you, Daphne, then go to Derrick, then go to Renee, then go to Nick. But since this Future of Tech Commission is done at the behest of the White House, and we're going to be delivering them a blueprint for a coordinated broad tech policy later this summer. And today's discussion is about the impact of platforms on our democracy and on our civil discourse. I'd ask each of you, what are your two top priorities for the Biden administration, knowing they're going to be in power for 3.5 more years, to ensure a vibrant but safe online space with specific focus on preserving and enhancing our democracy? Daphne, we'll go to you first, then Derrick, then Renee, then Nick.
So I'm going to make a recommendation that maybe will surprise some people familiar with my work and put a lot of my chips on aligning with Europe. And there's a big geopolitical reason for that, which is that if rights-respecting democracies don't get more aligned, we won't have a bulwark against the kinds of really troubling legal changes we're seeing in places like India right now. Now, there are a lot of things that we cannot do the same way Europe does, largely because of the First Amendment. So that's a barrier to be realistic about. But there are a bunch of things that we can do. I actually listed them in an op-ed in The Hill earlier this year. So the first is, like Europe doing with the Digital Services Act right now, we can be realistic about how content moderation works in the real world, with the reality that platforms get legal demands to take down videos of police brutality, for example, and there needs to be some mechanism to make sure those demands don't succeed. So there are models for that in the pending European law. The second big piece I think we can align on, or I hope we can, is breaking out what's a privacy issue, what's a competition issue, and what is a speech and CDA 230 issue. And don't try to tackle them all at once. Make good federal privacy laws, make smart competition laws, and break out the content moderation issues as part of considering changing CDA 230 and treat them independently also. And then the final thing is not to treat all platforms the same way. If we hold smaller platforms to standards that were designed for Facebook, then we won't have any platforms but Facebook. Companies, entities like Common Sense Media, which gets parent comments about movies and TV shows and books, they should not be held to the same standard that Facebook is in terms of liability for user posts. So I think all of those are really useful directions, and they have the benefit that we have a model to look at and a transatlantic dialogue to engage in that can help us see ways forward.
So Daphne, that's great. And Derrick, just one thing I'd mention in response, Daphne, we are not only interviewing Margrethe Vestager and some of the leading figures in Europe for this commission, but we're holding a couple of European town halls. Not that the US government necessarily wants to hear from Europe exactly how they should run the show here, but we are actually conducting a couple of European town halls to get input from Europe so that there is a transatlantic global perspective on some of the issues. So that's a great thing. My friend Derrick, your thoughts about the administration, a couple things you think the administration should really focus on immediately.
Well, I absolutely agree. We should work with other European nations that are democratic nations to have a uniform standard. Many of the technology platforms have grown to the point that they are sovereign nations in terms of size and scope. And for the United States, particularly 2016, and in many ways, all of the activities leading up to 2020 and elections through January 6th, these platforms can be used by foreign nations to cause harm, not only to people, but our democracy. We don't have a uniform standard for rogue nations and individuals who seek to manipulate the quality of life that we strive to have here in the United States, we're going to find ourselves in a state of chaos. It was shocking to see the outcome of the laissez-faire approach many of these platforms took, all playing out on television on January 6th. No one would have ever expected individuals to go to the Capitol with the type of violence and rage that we've seen under a notion of being a patriot, when in fact it was an act of treason, act of insurrection, much of which was being fueled by these platforms. And I tell anyone that what we realized on January 6th was the super spreaders that we created by not allowing our government to really put in place the necessary guardrails to keep people safe and protect our democracy.
Thank you, Derrick, very much for the opening. Renee, how about you? What's your perspective on sort of the opening message to the administration?
Yeah, so I think that we've been defining the problem, particularly in the work that I do, as a challenge of, what's true or false, or this idea of mis or disinformation. And I would argue that the bigger problem, and that the thing that the administration needs to prioritize, is the inability to come to consensus, which is facilitated in part by social platforms, but not entirely by social platforms. And so there's some interesting ways in which we can think about how Americans come to consensus in the modern information environment. And there's kind of policy, education, and design responses to improving that. I would say, as far as things, tangible things the administration can do as it prioritizes that idea of how do we reconstruct, or recalibrate around assisting our citizens in coming to consensus, is that first, the boring answer is we could always use more access to data, but this is where I think we do need to actually align with Europe, as Daphne mentioned. In the sense that right now there are certain trade-offs between privacy and research that are not necessarily symbiotic between the two. We're having a lot of difficulties with that. So there's this idea of better access to data to better understand the problem as it continues to evolve. Then there would be that education piece. How do we, what is the role of the government in educating the public about the information environment of the day? This is something that we did have in eras past. Propaganda is not new. We had entities that were responsible for helping the public understand the propaganda in the context of old information environments. We don't really have that today. And then the final thing I would say is multi-stakeholder engagements around specific understanding of the day-to-day nitty-gritty of the problem. And we can talk a little bit later about the way that we tried to pilot that with our election integrity partnership at SIO.
Okay, thanks a ton, Renee. Nick?
Still struggling with the mute button. Well, firstly, thank you for the invitation, and I'm very fortunate to go last because I can say I agree wholeheartedly with all of my colleagues. All their points are excellent. I think that the two or three things that come through for me, firstly, just to underline the US's leadership role in protecting the future of a global, open, free, secure internet is critical. And the US's regulatory approach at home and its foreign policy engagement abroad are critical to shaping that global debate and making sure that the values that underpin the internet continue to be ones of openness and freedom. Secondly, I think, again, to agree with previous speakers, we haven't got consensus on what the problems are we're trying to solve. So as a result, we're looking at a whole bundle of problems and trying to design one solution that will solve all of them. When in reality, I think we need to start separating them out, look at the evidence, and then actually figure out what's the smart solution for those particular problems. Political advertising is a very, very, very different issue to face than terrorist use of the internet, for example. And then finally, something that I think is often forgotten in these debates, the government has a huge responsibility and opportunity to use technology services to fill the information vacuum. Whether it's on COVID, on vaccines, on information around what foreign states are doing, the government has a huge microphone, and technology services enable more people to hear those messages of credibility from whether it's the CDC or the organizations working to combat extremism around the world. And I think often we see content removal as the solution to some of these problems, and don't always consider, if you remove content, who's filling that vacuum.
Could I jump in here, Jim?
Absolutely.
So, Daphne, could you just start off a little bit with one of the most salient debates here? In many ways, and you kind of hinted at this, the debate over CDA 230, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, has become a kind of bucket into which we are throwing all kinds of reform arguments. Could you just talk a little bit about what would happen? Because there are many groups and politicians who say we should get rid of CDA 230. Can you talk a little bit about what would happen if we did that? And then what smart reform of CDA 230 might look like?
Yeah, so I think the conversation has moved a little bit away from the idea that we can just cross it out, and toward the idea that maybe there are more tailored amendments to be made. I think there's increasing recognition that if you just cross it out, you push platforms in a direction of either being extremely overcautious and taking down way too much so that, legitimate controversial voices aren't heard, or being extremely permissive and never taking anything down so that their platform is just sort of a free-for-all mess. And so I think most of the proposals we've seen more recently involve something that is more nuanced than that. Realistically, though, the 30 or so CDA 230 reform proposals that came out over the past year and a half, for the most part, fell into a couple of buckets that don't go together. So this is reductive, but generally speaking, Democrats keep introducing bills to try to make platforms take down more user content, and Republicans keep trying to make platforms take down less user content. And you're not going to find bipartisan support for something that solves both those problems at once, because there just isn't something that solves both of those problems at once. So realistically, well, and I'll pause and say, I'm kind of glad that most of these things don't have traction, because I do think we have an education gap in DC where lawmakers are still catching up and understanding what unintended consequences of changes to 230 might look like. Usually these are things the drafters never intended. So for example, the one reform of 230 that passed so far, a law called Sesta Fosta, was intended to target a really serious harm. It was an extremely well-intentioned law targeting sex trafficking, but it was so poorly crafted that it had a bunch of unintended consequences with already vulnerable people being deplatformed. And now we have people like Elizabeth Warner and Ro Khanna calling for review of the bill to understand its harms. So, the risks of getting this wrong are very significant. The things that seem like maybe they could get traction, and this is just, very much an educated guess, but maybe we could see bipartisan support for something that, like Sesta Fosta, tackles a really serious agreed upon harm, across the aisle. Maybe we could see something that, like the PACT Act from Senators Schatz and Thune, is not about the government saying what speech to leave up or take down, but instead about process for how that happens. And then maybe there are ways forward that aren't about changing CDA 230 at all. So as I mentioned before, there are things to be done in the realm of privacy and in the realm of competition, some of which would actually help tackle these harmful content issues. And then there are some issues such as protecting civil rights online that I think can be addressed also in ways that don't have to touch on CDA 230, although they also can. And so we're starting to see legislation introduced along those lines. So I think there are some interesting ways forward, but they aren't about dictating new rules for what content gets left up or taken down.
Let's talk about protecting civil rights online and also dealing with hate speech. Derrick, you were part of the Stop Hate for Profit campaign. Can you talk a little bit about where you think the most promising reform may be? Do you see sort of the problem of hate speech as one that's really going to be dealt with by the platforms, if at all? And how should they deal with it in ways that they're not dealing with it now? Or do you see this as a place where Congress or the White House should be active as well?
I don't think the platforms are prepared to truly deal with hate speech. Far too many of them, particularly Facebook, they profit from hate speech. If you think about the group Boogaloo that was in the Bay Area, that group was able to advertise on the platform, recruit members, and from there carry out harm. It's a profit proposition for them. even with the campaign, with over 1,000 companies, some of the major corporations, including Unilever and Procter & Gamble and Coke signing on to stop advertising, we didn't put a dent in their profit margin. It was less than 10%, because small dollar ad buying is where they really make their money. And white supremacist groups, they have perfected the art to recruit members and really project a much larger existence than what they really are. And so we must depend on policymakers. Now, this is a concern I have. If you look at what's taking place in the Senate, we couldn't get 60 members to vote for a commission to investigate what happened on January 6th. So it's hard for Congress to pass anything where they can't agree on how to investigate a threat to themselves, because whether a Democrat or Republican, all of them was at harm on January 6th. Then when you look at the administration, they have to take this very serious. And I'll be looking to see whether or not the Department of Justice step up aggressively, Department of Homeland Security, because this is a concern of national threat, particularly with domestic terrorists. And unfortunately, we only have about a year before we know whether or not Congress is going to shift from the House or the Senate, whether or not it's going to shift political parties. So it has to be the administration to act aggressively, either through Homeland Security, by deeming this an issue of national security, or Department of Justice.
Let me actually just turn to Nick on this larger question, because this claim has been made, right, that one of the things that is stopping platforms from dealing with hate speech is financial motivations. And I wonder whether you could just talk a little bit, since Derrick was only really talking about Facebook, but what do you think the obstacles are to dealing with more aggressively with hate speech, and how much does, say, financial motivation work into that?
Well, interestingly, I think, we took a decision on something like political advertising, where we said that the revenue was something we would rather make a decision on not allowing political advertising and forego that revenue based on our concerns around the impact political advertising and micro-targeting had on the public conversation. So from our point of view, our policies go far beyond certainly US criminal law. We have a wide range of policies to take action on hateful conduct. We've actually expanded them this week to expand the way we deal with people denying violent events, including those targeting protected groups. So I think one of the hardest challenges that I know we face is the enforcing these policies at scale. And so the nuance, the context, when I think, we've seen in recent weeks discussion of how AI is still not very good at recognizing the difference between people pointing out counter speech and people who are calling for hate. So for us, we want to take the burden off victims, which means more automation. That comes with its own challenges. But then also, I think we still have, and this goes to the point that Daphne made earlier, in some contexts, we're told we take down too much. In other contexts, we're told we don't take down enough. We get very different signals internationally. There's no real consistency there. And so this is something that's constantly evolving. One of the other challenges that I think has been particularly difficult for us, whenever we change policies, bad actors change their behavior to try and get around the policies. Some have become, and previously, we've had to make big policy changes to capture these people who move around our policies. The one hope I have, I think it's a really good sign, particularly as Derrick was talking about there, the national security space. The relationships that industry has built with government around the election, information sharing, declassifying intelligence, making sure that we understand the threats that government sees, I think those relationships can transfer into that terrorism space, so we can take action earlier. We see what's happening on Twitter, but if law enforcement is seeing something different happening in closed groups in the real world, the sooner that we know that information, we can make sure our policies are effective and enforce them. And so I think that the collaboration that was built in the election space shows a model where we can increase government and industry working together to protect in the national security space as well.
So Renee, you led one of those efforts in the EI partnership that you're mentioning before, that was through the Internet Observatory at the Cyber Policy Center. What so based on that experience, you talk a little bit maybe about that report and the experience that you had, what you did over the last year, but what lessons do you take away from that in terms of how the platform should be changing their policies, either when it comes to hate speech and potential, offline harm, or toward disinformation and election interference?
Yeah, so the work that we did was narrowly scoped to voting misinformation, mis and disinformation. So we didn't really touch on hate speech or that type of content. But what I'll say about the EIP work was that we put together a multi-institution. So there were 4 core research institutions. It was Stanford Internet Observatory, University of Washington Center for an Informed Public, Digital Forensics Research Lab, DFR Lab, and then Graphica. And so we all had slightly different capabilities, but what we were able to do was scope on the topic of voting, mis and disinformation specifically, which included suppression narratives, it included allegations of fraud, it included demonstrably falsifiable claims, you should vote on Wednesday, that sort of thing. And what we did for about 100 days leading into the election was the 4 research institutions with about 120 analysts used a combination of technology and then investigations by the analysts to understand false and misleading claims and narratives related to the voting areas that we'd scoped. And what we did was we created a JIRA ticketing system, and we had members of different stakeholder groups participating in the process as well. So we had the tech platforms on there. We had DHS CISA, Chris Krebs's team, which was working on countering misinformation related to voting at a federal government level. We had some civil society organizations in there for various targeted groups, AARP, NAACP. So we had a handful of these different types of stakeholders who were all participating. And the point of having this sort of centralized ticketing system that we came up with was really just to say, hey, we're seeing this thing, other stakeholder over here, you should take a look at this thing. And we weren't telling the platforms, this is what your policy should be, this is what you should take down. But what we did do is we did evaluate platform policies and their ability to capture the kind of, or the ability to address, I should say, the kinds of actions that we were seeing as they evolved over time. And so what you saw during the election was platforms evolving their policies in part in response to bad actors evolving their tactics. And this is a dynamic that is going to go on forever. And so the value of the sort of system that we built to do this was that it surfaced things so that the various actor types, the various stakeholder types could act effectively and quickly, and everybody was on the same page about the specifics of the information itself. So it provided, in a sense, a way to look at and understand specific narratives as they were moving through the digital ecosystem. So as they were going viral, for example, or in the early indications that they might go viral. We are now taking that same approach and looking at COVID vaccine, again, very specific buckets, not just people saying, I don't like the COVID vaccine, but very specific types of claims, and evaluating that, again, the efficacy of that same multi-stakeholder relationship towards addressing it. And one of the recommendations that we've made is that this is the sort of thing where it's not clear that this should live in academia at all. Actually, this is one of the things that government should be assessing, which is, where does that kind of model work? We have things like ISACs for information sharing, and actually the election integrity ISAC was a participant in this process during the election integrity partnership. There isn't really such a thing, as we found, specific to health misinformation. That infrastructure, that kind of partner, that partner was absent. There was nothing there. There was kind of a void. There was no consortium of entities at the state and local level that were responsible for addressing public health misinformation the way that there was that consortium available for addressing election misinformation. So again, the understanding of how should we think about this, the system isn't going away. Mis and disinformation has always been an issue. And so this is the modern manifestation of the challenge. So given that this is where we are, while we can work on things like policies and design and education to mitigate the specifics of the harm or change how the infrastructure is assembled, in the meantime, in the near term, there needs to be this ability, this kind of information sharing capability. And that is where, we're saying, we don't know necessarily that it lives at Stanford or lives in academia, but there's value to having this kind of collaborative communication and assessment. And we think that there should be more of it.
Hey, Nate, can I ask a follow-up to you all? Because around the 230 thing, that we've heard at in other discussions from the public early on, which is, why don't why don't we treat, and Daphne, acknowledging that we don't necessarily need to treat all the platforms the same. That was one of your opening points. But why don't we treat the large platforms, the Facebooks, the Twitters, the YouTubes, et cetera, as publishers, the way we do other huge publishers of information, and regulate them that way and hold them liable? Why do we not basically hold the platforms liable for what's on their platform, particularly if they're at the scale that the really large tech platforms are? So I'd like to ask that to everybody as sort of a general question. Because we've solved a lot of those issues in general over time by treating everybody as publishers and having them legally liable. And obviously 230 is a immunity shield for the really big players.
Was that to us generally? I can tackle that if you want.
Yeah, at a high level, you don't have to get up right. But why? Yeah, and I'd like to hear people who agree that we should treat you guys as publishers.
Sure. So at a super high level, entities that are treated as publishers only give the microphone to a very tiny privileged slice of the potential speakers in the world. You know, Walter Cronkite gets to speak, but gay and lesbian rights activists don't. And so what's different about today's platforms is that because the platforms aren't just automatically responsible for having lawyers assess every single thing that we say before it can go live, that means that everybody does have the opportunity to tweet and have it go out immediately. And, you know, there isn't this lawyerly barrier to being able to speak online. So I think, you know, treating YouTube as though it were NBC News would be a huge shift in who gets to ever be seen or heard on YouTube, because YouTube does not have enough lawyers and will never have enough lawyers to vet everybody's speech. And if they're going to vet some people's speech, we all know who they're going to prioritize. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't have special rules for the biggest platforms. That's absolutely what's going on in the Digital Services Act in Europe, for example, right, with this euphoniously named category, the VLAPs, very large online platforms. They have huge additional obligations about risk assessment, mitigation plans, audits, ongoing relationships with regulators. Like, there's a very special treatment for huge platforms there. And I think we could do something similar here, but taking it so far as to kind of roll back the clock and live in a world where we have nothing but the NBC Nightly News and, you know, no open platform for the, you know, voices from more marginalized groups, I don't think is the right way forward.
Derrick, you want to respond?
I say democracy is messy. What the platform have done, they have allowed for the media to be so democratized that anyone with a device is now a reporter or a storyteller or you name it. And because it's so messy, we really do need to have a container to allow for voice to come through, creativity come through, but in a way where it was not causing harm. Unfortunately, policymakers are archaic compared to how fast platforms are evolving over time. I worked on a Hill. I can tell you that many people who work in policy in DC, we are light years behind where the technology is in terms of understanding it, more or less putting forth a set of policies and rules to govern it. Then when you couple that with the type of money that technology companies have to put forth aggressive lobbying efforts to block, you know, any regulations, we find ourselves in the deficit. That's why at the beginning of the conversation, the statement of we should better align with what Europe is doing is so attractive to me, because there we know they have a better handle on where the technology is going and how to govern. And if we start there as a platform, perhaps we can then begin to think around how do we staff policymakers with the type of expertise to look at the evolving technology as it moves forward.
So, hey, Nick, do you feel like Twitter's shouldn't be held liable for anything on your platform? I mean, because if you take your quest, Daphne, to the point of, hey, because everybody gets to point their thing, there can't be, well, then you end up with a situation where you can have the big lie on everything that happens in society. I mean, I'm just saying, if you take that point of view to the extreme, you are where you are right now, which is there's no liability. And again, Obviously, Twitter's had to stand up and make certain decisions, as has YouTube and other, Facebook and other. But Nick, where do you come down on that? As a citizen of what used to be Europe, part of Europe, but also, you being the head of policy at one of the biggest platforms that we're all talking about here.
Well, I think just to echo something that Daphne, I think one of the reasons why this debate hangs around is it seems like a simple solution. Oh, we take an existing regulatory model, apply it to a new industry, and then all the problems that we care about go away. Well, I don't know about anyone else, but I was watching TV during the election. There was some inaccurate information on television and in other news media sources, if I can be diplomatic to put it that way. So the idea that an existing regulatory model solves these problems, I think is fanciful. And I think more importantly, I think we can get to a point where we agree that the New York Times and YouTube are different. And they have different products. They have a different way, you can go onto YouTube and post videos whenever you like. That's not how the New York Times letters page works. And so I think the fundamental differences in terms of how this empowers people, I also think it's really important to say, and this was mentioned earlier on, particularly around the world route, that kind of regulatory framework is being used to silence people who are criticizing governments, who are citizen journalists who are exposing violence and brutality at the hands of the state. And those voices needed online platforms to be able to get that message out. And so I think we need to get past this idea that we can take an existing model. And I think that's where the DSA does say we need to look at the systems and the processes in place. Are you understanding risk? Are you limiting risk? But also, content moderation is more than just taking things down or leaving things up. There's a range of different things you can do. So I think to Derrick's point exactly, one of the biggest challenges is we're still having a conversation about publishers versus platforms when the world has moved on from that many, many years ago. And I think we need to start really focusing in on what are the specific problems we want to solve? What are the solutions that scale in a way that protects our values and addresses harm? And then who are the best placed people to do this? Because some of the groups that, for example, we work with on stalking and harassment, taking someone's account down from a social media thing isn't a remedy if you're being stalked. You need offline intervention to protect your safety. There may be case for law enforcement intervention, prosecution. We need the whole of society response. So I think one of the big challenges right now is we look at a lot of policy problems as how do we solve the whole problem through technology? And I think that's where we start then stumbling into these solutions that have the unintended consequences that could be really harmful for marginalized voices around the world.
Just real quick, I think Nick said it much better than I did. We cannot take old policy and apply it to new technology. It's an imperfect fit.
I want to encourage people to put some questions in the Q&A. But Renee, did you want to jump in on this issue as well as Jim posed it?
I think one of the interesting areas here on the new technology is really the notion of things like reach, right? The notion of things like curation and the notion of things like amplification. And per Nick's comment, it's not a binary up or down. And I think that we've seen some really interesting politicization of interventions like labeling or, which is almost sort of like a counter speech model of here's what this person said and we're leaving the content up, but here's this fact check or here's this, clarification or what have you. And that too has been sort of, kind of lumped under the rubric of censorship by those who are politically incentivized to do so. And so there's an interesting challenge that we face today, which is I think the debate about what should come up and what should come down still remains the sort of central conversation about this particular problem, when the questions of things like curation, right? How did all of those people wind up in those, in some of the groups that then in turn stormed the Capitol? Well, we actually have, we have some data that suggests that actually, in fact, it was because they were recommended into them. And so that sort of dynamic is a very interesting thing, which is what is the liability of a platform, not for allowing the content to be on there, but is there a higher standard of care that should be applied in the platform's curation model, which says not only is this allowed to stay on the platform, okay, maybe we say that actually is maximization of freedom of expression, but what happens when it's proactively served up to people? How are we actually defining harm? That is a thing that I think also has, as we've seen with some of the recent conversations and walkbacks on policy around COVID, specific niche areas of the policies on COVID, we don't really have necessarily the most articulate kind of cohesive definition of the concept of harm. We moved from a kind of very rapid, almost pandemic precipitated process of this is all fine to all of this is harmful. And I think that now we're in this this process of sorting that out, and this is where actually the new administration and others should be weighing in as we establish what those what those more nuanced definitions actually are.
Can you talk about what you think the most successful interventions have been, though, at the platform level, whether you're talking about election-related disinformation or COVID, or and you mentioned labeling. I think there's, as you mentioned, that ends up engendering its own opposition. But what do you think is the assuming we can define the problematic content, and that's a big assumption, right? But assuming one could, what do you think has been the most successful strategy that the platforms have used, let alone what governments might mandate to address that kind of content?
Well, this goes back to one of the things I mentioned early on, which is our data access challenges. So we have some visibility into when when certain tweets are throttled, or if a tweet is labeled, we can see a drop off in subsequent reshares of that tweet. So if a misinformation tweet receives a label, there's our assumption from the outside. I'm going to kind of punt this one over to Nick in a second. But because he actually has the data that can tell you exactly what is what they're seeing as impactful in a way that I just can't. On Facebook, we have a lot less visibility. One of the things that I looked at about a year and a half ago, prior to the pandemic starting, was looking at did the policy to remove certain anti-vaccine pages from recommendations and to prevent them from selling ads, was that did we see anything that we could potentially identify as a decrease in engagement with that content? And this was a really hard thing for us to try to scope because we didn't have any sort of control. We couldn't see what the interventions actually were. We could read the articulated policy, but an articulated policy and an actual implementation or execution of said policy is not a thing that we necessarily have visibility into. So it actually didn't really seem to do a whole lot. To be perfectly honest, we didn't see a significant decrease in engagement with the pages. We didn't see a significant decrease in follower count rising, except for 2 pages that had been quite prominently covered in the news media. So it wasn't, and that was our challenge again, because all we have is a CrowdTangle dashboard that shows the end result, but we don't really see what percentage, fewer accounts were served that content, or was there a decrease in conversion to the page following its removal from the recommendation engine? So here's where I'll actually kind of kick that over to Nick and say, what are you guys seeing, and how are you thinking through that? And
I'll say by way of praising Twitter, you can respond to Renee, at least when it comes to data with academics, that Twitter in the last year has done some revolutionary things to make data available to academics. So I want to throw some love your way on that other platforms should follow. But why don't you pick up where Renee left off, and then I have a question for Derrick.
Well, no, and I think one of the frustrating things, certainly from an industry point of view, is I think platforms simultaneously saying that metric isn't the right metric to measure our work by, and then not providing the data to give you the other metric, isn't a really helpful contribution to the discussion. We took a decision, for example, in 2018, really good example here. Foreign states running disinformation on Twitter, we would remove the accounts, all the data would disappear, no one learns anything. Because at the point at which we attributed that as a foreign state and then removed it, unless someone had been proactively archiving it, they would lose access to that data. So we took a decision to publish the archive of that data. It's available online. We give it to hundreds of academics around the world. It now runs, I think, to upwards of 40 million tweets and several terabytes of media. One of the good things that policymakers could do, and actually the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism is doing some work on policy issues in this area through its legal working group. Privacy law actually is stopping some of this. So I think there are definitely some circumstances in which platforms are taking a conservative view to interpretation. But I think there is a space there for good privacy law, good regulatory guidance will actually enable companies to share more data proactively with the public and with researchers. And then I think to the broader question of non-content removal interventions. One of the things that we did actually was to make it incredibly clear to people, we would remove the engagement functions. You can't tweet, you can't retweet, you can't reply. That was really effective. And I think the other thing we did, which we did publish data on, was we nudged people before they shared something they hadn't read to say, hey, would you like to read this first? We saw a 40% decrease in the number of people, but overall, some of you may have seen the image cropping paper we published a few weeks ago. This is a priority area for us where through our academic data access and also our responsible machine learning team, we need to put more data in the public domain to help this debate be informed. And I think the responsibilities on the platforms to do that and then highlight the blockers they see. And I think we've got to stop responding to academics with you've got the wrong data if we're not going to provide that data ourselves.
Can I just move a little? I want to deal with the audience questions in a second with and Daphne. I'll target one of them at you. But Derrick, one of the issues that Nick raised, and I think Renee gestured toward, is how different is the internet, right, from other types of media? Whether we're talking about hate speech or disinformation, right, we're seeing it in all kinds of media. And especially given how polarized politics has gotten in the United States, and not just polarized, but where the norms have broken down as to what people can say and do, frankly. And you mentioned the January 6th commission and how that didn't even get off the ground, at least in because of the Senate. Is there something unique about the online space, or is it just reflective of what we're seeing in other media as well?
I think it's extremely unique. It's like a super spreader. Before you can kind of contain disinformation to regions or very local, with the internet, it's global instantly. You think about some of the world's worst atrocities. The radio was one of the message conveyors. CBs was a message conveyor. Large rallies and gatherings were message conveyors. But even with those as message conveyors, it was a finite number of individuals who could hear and respond. With the internet, it is absolute groundbreaking how fast bad information can spread. The big lie is not a new strategy. If you think about, for me, I like history. I look at the ending of the Civil War and how the Confederacy used the big lie around Reconstruction to embolden former Confederate soldiers to begin to have violent coup d'etats in local community by local community. How that was spread from Colfax, Louisiana, where the first reported coup took place, up the Mississippi River, was from a newspaper reporter out of South Carolina who was reporting back to South Carolina. So you're seeing it go from Colfax to Mississippi. By the next year, you begin to see it in South Carolina. Then there was a reporter from Florida and South Carolina, but it spread. It took 2 years to spread. That same type of activity with the internet would take 2 seconds to spread. Yeah. And emboldening people to do very dangerous, commit a very dangerous act. Think about, Nazi Germany having the internet during that period of time. World War II may have turned out very different than what we see today, or what took place in Rwanda with the atrocities there. That was all done by radio, but they had the internet and access. That would have been even more horrendous than what we found it to be. So the internet is light years further ahead than any other mode of communication that we've ever seen in the world.
And just to pick up on that question, Nate, because some of what we're hearing from the audience and some of the audience questions is, where's the sense of urgency? Is, look, you're watching the evisceration of fundamental democratic norms in America. And by the way, fundamental norms about hate and racist speech that if 5 years ago in my poli-sci class at Stanford, I would have never predicted you would have seen. And so there's a real, and I pose that to folks because not to say that your thoughts aren't well, but you have, and I hear this, we hear this a lot at Common Sense from parents, even in the context of just the content that their kids are exposed to on various platforms, which is, where's the sense of urgency in dealing with the evisceration of like sort of fundamental norms of our democracy, we're going to take 5 years to figure out a balanced solution to this or that. I mean, how do people respond to that? Because I actually think that's a very important issue now that we have to, and by the way, some of our audience questions are about it, like, how long are we going to wait on some of these issues before, even if they're imperfect solutions, we have some serious regulatory answers for some of these issues? I put that more broadly.
Right. So I'm going to pick up and not talk too long, right? This time last year when we was organizing Stop Hate for Profit, friend Jonathan, he was talking about the spread of anti-Semitic hate. I was talking about, racism and the spread of hate and the what was going on the border hate. Here are the ingredients for an explosion. And I have a belief that we have a year. Last year we was talking about individual harm and hate, but I began to talk about this can undermine our democracy, and it did. So now we have this ingredients. We have the underlining issue of otherness that have always pestered this nation because we've operated on a caste system under a race as a social construct, right? Whether it's ethnic otherness, gender otherness, orientation, this otherness. You get a demagogue type personality like we just seen in the White House with a platform, which is a super spreader. You put those things together and people's fear and misery and everything else, it accelerates so fast that before you know it, things are destroyed. We have 1 year.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to be an alarmist here. We have 1 year because when we get to this time next year, everything is about the November election cycle. So this administration have to have the type of urgency to do something now, because if we don't begin to do something now, it may advance so fast we won't put the genie back in the bottle.
And so what if you offended some people who didn't get their little bizarre point out there, but you were protecting sort of basic norms of democracy? The reason I said that is some of the question. And as a sort of academic, because I'm a professor, but not a real academic, because I'm really an advocate, I'm like, how long are we going to wait to debate all this stuff? I mean, is it sort of, Nero fiddles while Rome burns? You're literally looking at some of the most fundamental things that we all took for granted a few years ago being eviscerated. And then we're going, and by the way, Nick, I'm definitely not looking at you, because I actually think Twitter has, probably more than any of the other big players, stepped up and done stuff. I mean, I might have banned Trump a couple of years earlier, but at the same time, Twitter's probably got out there more than any other of the big companies. But how long before the public goes, I mean, how long are we going to let this go while we debate the nuances of some of these issues? Because we don't want to make this little mistake over here, or this little mistake over here, but the core is rotting. That's the reason I say it is that we have a number of people in the questions asking that.
Well, can I ask this in a different way a little bit, which is that if you have 40% or more of the population who is supporting what you might consider a fringe view, right? How are the companies supposed to respond to that? I mean, the deplatforming of the president of the United States, whether you agree with it or not, it's a significant move, and probably one that we don't want a corporation. Look, we would be concerned if a U.S. corporation were doing that willy-nilly, not just in the U.S. but around the world, right? Deplatforming, and so but we rely on them to make these calls because the government is not going to come up with rules that go forward. So, Nick, maybe it would be useful for you to talk a little bit about, in answer to Jim's question, whether referencing that particular decision, and certainly Jack Dorsey was uncomfortable with the fact that you all had to make that decision. But what are the ingredients that go into a decision like that? And does this suggest a new normal, or if it's not a new normal, what's the precedent that's set going forward, and how you then would deal with this kind of speech or these kinds of accounts?
No, happy to. And certainly after we made that decision, Jack published his thread and made very clear that the kind of the fundamental questions that it raised were ones that were bigger than certainly one company. So we opened up a public comment period, asked people to give feedback. We ended up having more than 48,000 responses to that process. It was the biggest public call we've ever had. And now we're working through processing some of that feedback. And And there are tensions here. We were getting simultaneously the desire to be more aggressive on content moderation, but also recognizing that if speech was happening, it was important to preserve it, to allow scrutiny, response, civil society engagement, because if that speech disappears, well, there's no record of it happening. And so I think the tension between the kind of the transparency of speech being available and the harms that Derrick outlines is something that, that is very clearly in tension. We did try some things. We tried, for example, removing engagement. We tried different labels, whether it was a click through to read this tweet versus a label underneath. We've recently started being more transparent about how we think about strikes, so the number of times we allow someone. And then we obviously published a detailed blog post when we took the decision on the former president's account that spoke of the words on the platform being interpreted by other people as meaning something that was directly going to cause harm. All of those things, I think, we recognize our policy framework needs to be more complex and more nuanced to deal with. But I think the question I think I still come back to is, even with that policy framework, if we do reach a point of removing people from the platform, as you mentioned, there are a significant number of people who share a viewpoint. Deplatforming someone doesn't change anyone's mind. And so I think the second part of this question is, if there are people who are subscribing to views that are going against democratic norms, how do we re-engage those people and how do we bring them back? And I think one of the big challenges is content moderation is a fairly blunt tool for doing that. You can stop the spread of a message, but you can't change people's mind who've already heard a message. And so I think that's why the question of philanthropy, for example, but these are the kind of civic initiatives and civic engagement that we're going to need, because the polarization you see in policy discussions, in social discussions, is going to require a different solution than technology interventions. And I think that conversation in terms of urgency is equally as urgent as figuring out these hard regulatory questions.
Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, just jump in on Jim's original question. If I don't sound panicked, that means my deep breathing exercises are working. But I absolutely get the sense of urgency. But the thing is, if we spend the next year passing a law that will just get struck down by the courts as unconstitutional, we will have wasted our shot. So and there are many proposals out there that sound good, but that will only work if we get the Supreme Court to overturn settled precedent. And I don't want to gamble on that. Or maybe there are cases where you do want to gamble on that, but you need to be super informed about what the risks are that you're taking on by backing a particular piece of legislation and whether it turns on this current Supreme Court doing something that it may or may not actually do. And so I think taking the time to get that part right is extreme. We will screw it up if we don't.
So can I push back on that, even though I'm the moderator? Because I will give you an example of something where we did that, and I'm happy to tell you. So as some of you may know, we wrote all the violent video game laws in the United States. We wrote them in California, we wrote them in Michigan, we wrote them in a number of different states around the country. And basically we held the companies liable for creating sexually violent and ultra-violent video games and selling them to minors, okay? Now, when we did that, Daphne, as someone who is a Stanford law graduate and teaches undergraduate con law here for more than 30 years, I had conversations, including with the great Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was governor then, and the governor of Michigan and Illinois and others, saying we may get this struck down in the Supreme Court in 4 years. By the time the case gets up to the Supreme Court, we know that this is going to be a very complicated thing, because Scalia was my con law professor, so I know exactly what his point of view is on this case, et cetera. So we knew going in that at that point, there was a 50% chance or greater that by the time the case made it up to the US Supreme Court, given the composition of that Supreme Court, the law might get struck down. In the 3.5 years it took from the passage of those laws to the actual striking down in a 5-4 decision of the law, the fundamental behavior of the video game industry changed. And we knew that going in. We knew that we might not win legally given the composition of the court. And now you have an even more conservative court in place. And we still did it because it changed everybody's behavior. It changed the company's behavior and it changed the public. So my only pushback on that is when you have a sense of urgency and you have really big issues, sometimes you have to gamble that the 3 or 4 years before the Supreme Court will take the case up, because they're not going to take it up on an emergency appeal. They're going to make it go through the lower courts. It's worth it if you prevent fundamental harms to sort of democratic norms. I say it because that's a totally legitimate point of view, but I also think it underscores why coming up with the right balance of both private sector solutions, Nick, that I think Twitter has been out there more on any other company, and then some degree of regulatory intervention now. Because my big fear is knowing the senators involved. Derrick, we know very well we talk to all the key guys in Congress about this. We're very worried they're going to slow walk all this stuff for another 2 or 3 years. And what is the damage 2 or 3 years? That's when you say you have a year to get this done. They finally, you get some congressional action in 2023, it could be too late. So again, I asked it a hard way because I do think we have to address some of those challenges, even if the solutions are not one size fit all and are not perfect. Okay.
That echoes something in the question, the answer. Maybe Daphne, you could take a quick stab at this, which is we're asked who the leading people in Congress are who are supporting initiatives and legislation in these areas, and maybe if there's any. You mentioned the downsides with Sesta Fosta, but are there, whether it's CDA 230 or other kinds of reforms that you could point to, either the people who are behind them or the particular reforms that you want to highlight?
Yeah, so I will find a list and put it in the chat because the list is so long, I definitely don't know it all. But Clark introduced the Civil Rights Bill. Schatz and Thune are behind the PACT bill. Blumenthal was a big proponent of the Earn It Act, which was about child sexual abuse material, really terrible stuff online. There's Senator Warner's Safe Tech Act, which kind of attacks a scattershot set of issues. So there are a whole lot of people working on this, and I will find I will find an actual resource and put it in the chat for people.
Are there any particular proposals that you think are smart of that list that you mentioned?
So I think that the PACT Act is smart about needing to focus on process, focus on a way to, for example, avert the problem of bad faith accusations that cause platforms to silence, important speech, things like that. So I think the PACT Act is very smart. And then in the civil rights world, there isn't a bill that I think is drafted perfectly, but there's this issue I think we can really carve out, which is the claim, seemingly correct claim, that Facebook is targeting ads for housing and employment and credit based on users' race or gender or classifications like that. Facebook keeps saying that that's 230 immunized, and I'm not sure that actually is 230 immunized. But in any case, that is an example of a low-hanging fruit in the civil rights realm that seems like it could either be the target of clearly defined legislation or just sorted out in the courts.
That's another question we had in chat, and maybe either Daphne and or Renee may want to jump in on this, which is whether platforms could be held responsible as publishers for recommendations. Now, Daphne, you've been working on a piece, I know, on whether regulating algorithms is actually as easy as people think, and that's sort of related to this. And then Renee, you were talking about the problem with group recommendations. Is there a way forward here with saying that the recommendation systems are cause for liability, but that whereas keep the other elements of CDA 230 intact?
Well, so if the problem is that the recommendation introduced the harm, which is this Facebook targeted ad scenario, where it's like, this is a perfectly normal housing ad. The harm is that it was targeted so that only white people saw it. That I think can be targeted with regulation. If the problem is there is dangerous or even illegal speech posted by users, and then the platforms are promoting it through their algorithms, that gets complicated because, for better or for worse, what the Supreme Court precedent says is Congress can't go in and say, oh, just demote that. They get into the exact same constitutional level of review that they would face if they said delete it. So shifting from Congress saying, hey, delete this stuff, to Congress saying, hey, stop amplifying this stuff, doesn't solve any of the underlying problems that we had already. and frankly, if we believed that we had a way that platforms could accurately identify what's illegal in order to demote it or stop amplifying it, let's just make them take it down, right? So I think there's a lot of optimism about regulating amplification that I fear is probably misplaced.
Renee, do you want to jump in here on that? I mean, because the group recommendations at Facebook have been sort of the subject. Well, actually, they turned off the recommendation of political groups once that was identified during the election as being a potential area, not a potential, an actual area of concern. Is that what is the right way, if any, to try to regulate the amplification of problematic content or recommendation systems like this?
Well, this is where, and I think, I'm not sure if this is a totally unpopular point of view, but this is where I think that a lot of the reason that happened was self-regulatory. And that was because there was a particular amount of research that was done, that was presented to the public, that the media covered, that created a degree of pressure, that created a degree of really unpopular public opinion about the platforms. And these are their customers expressing this displeasure that then in turn leads to a decision to investigate internally and take it down. Now, that is not always the ideal way, because that is, again, relying on the good faith actor of participant in the, in the ecosystem. But I do think for certain things, we don't necessarily need a written regulation for everything. Whereas if there was perhaps, again, more data sharing, the ability to detect these things, and then it's sort of more of an overall oversight model or information sharing, then we can move things in particular directions on the design front that don't necessarily require the government to come in and legislate the design.
And I completely agree with that. There's so much that platforms can do that is not inside this binary of take it up or leave it down. And Eric Goldman has a great paper out right now just listing all of the things that platforms do already and things that they could do. So there's huge room for improvements. It's just not clear there are huge rooms for legally mandated improvements.
So Nate, I know we're running close to the end of time. If people can stay, I'm going to use Pacific Standard Time because I know we're not all in the same time zone, Derrick. But if we can stay for another like 8 or 10 minutes, can everybody do that? And then we'll cut you off. Everybody okay? Because we're at the crux of some of the most important issues here. Back to you, Nate, on the questions.
Why don't you say which crux you would like to?
Well, I think the real one. I think the real one, honestly, here is: would it be better to pass? This is the regulatory one, because I think we've spoken. You've heard a fair amount about the roles that the companies themselves can take, but I think there is a broad sense of there has to be some kind of government role here, right? And the government's been missing in action on these issues for more than a decade. So, and if Derrick is correct in positing, you basically have a year to deal with this, or if it doesn't get dealt with, the consequences are that you're going to fall into the 22 election cycle and no one's going to deal with anything. The question to me is it better to pass an imperfect law that may get struck down by the courts, but that sends a very clear message about preservation of basic democratic norms, as opposed to the more arduous, the more complicated task of you and Daphne? We know that some of the different bills you're referring to, none of them really take the issues head on for some of the reasons that you've said. Even the Warner bill, which was originally going to be the most strong, doesn't really go at it. Is there anyone who wants to take the point of view that it's worth it to pass a law that ultimately might run afoul of certain of the current U.S. Supreme Court? Because I think you have to look at the composition of the court and because I don't think they're reflective of America, by the way. I think they're reflective of a very, very conservative slice of America. I'm very comfortable saying that as a professor. So do we really want to wait for that? Or would it be better to try to get, even though the two parties are coming from different angles on it, some really fairly strong regulatory structure in place this year that's going to force companies to take a more active role in particularly the fundamental undermining of the democratic norms that we've seen in a way that I never thought would happen in my lifetime. Is it worth it to risk that?
Well, can I say one thing here, which is that I think there's, and now I'm taking off my moderator's hat, I think there's a lot you can do that would still be constitutional to deal with some of these things. So so take something like, greater accountability for the promises that the platforms make, right? So you can craft a law that is not a national hate speech law, but that forces the platforms to be accountable for the standards that they articulate, right? This is a kind of the co-governance model that that a lot of what happens in Europe, right? And you can have outside accountability, force them, outside auditors, to monitor the platforms' promises on how they're dealing with content. And so that's a way of marrying both transparency and accountability together. I mean, in some ways, I think, and Nick, you can maybe speak to this, what the platforms, I believe them when they say that they do want regulation right here. What, if you were to point to like the right trajectory that regulation could go in, what would that look like? I mean, Daphne mentioned some of the CDA 230 ideas, but there are certain things that I don't even think the company wants to be dealing with some of these issues.
Sure. Well, I think there's lots of proposals on the table, and perhaps this is the point I'm supposed to make a theme park joke. But in terms of the work that's been done, for example, with the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership, which is really speaking to that point of set out those best practices and then measure how you perform against them. So making sure you have systems and processes in place that tackle child sexual exploitation, that tackle terrorist content online. And then I think the other thing is drive those standards, not just through the biggest companies, but down into smaller platforms. I think one of the most undiscussed factors and changes that is happening right now is that many of the hearings that I go to, it's Google, Facebook, Twitter. And there is a layer of companies underneath that who are actually far, far bigger than often people appreciate, who have reaches into certain communities that in some cases might be bigger than a company like Twitter, for whom are operating outside of that spotlight. And so I think we may well be sort of moving the problem into other places without the scrutiny. So I think we need to make sure we're not doing that unwittingly, but I think you can definitely set clear standards. And then I think to Jim's broader point, I think one of the other things is, these issues don't live in isolation online. And I think if we're talking about protecting things like democratic values, that starts with protecting people's ability to participate in an election at the ballot box. And so I think one of the biggest opportunities is to make sure that we, again, don't over-index towards one part of the problem. You have a holistic solution that makes sure that, voter suppression material and foreign interference in elections is taken down quickly. I think there's still an open question on a number of things you can do in the political advertising space that, to Nate's point, are still very much focused on transparency and a constitutional, and also protect people's ability to vote. And by tackling all of those things, you then build up those sort of democratic foundations that Jim talks about and we care deeply about. But that for me is the crux of the next sort of year, 2 years, is clearly defining the problem we're trying to solve, identifying all the facets of where the challenges become, and then building a solution that hits off all of those things. Because I think the worst thing that could happen in 2 years' time is you get that tech-focused regulation, and we realize that actually the problem hasn't been solved because it's moved to a smaller platform, it's moved to closed spaces that might not be considered a tech platform at all. Text messaging is still very popular around the world. And then also looking at actually what's the and I think this is a lesson perhaps from Sester Foster, there are existing powers that the government has that may well not be being used to the full sum of the law that could be used today to tackle some of these problems. And so I think we always need to figure out it's not always about needing a new tool. It's sometimes about saying, are there tools already there that we could use smarter to tackle some of these issues?
That's an extremely good point. And here's what I would like to say. We've run a little over time. Thank you so much. That's a great actually closing point, Nick. And I was gonna say to Derrick, Daphne, Renee, do you each have like one short final comment that you'd like to make? Nate, you too, thank you so much for being such a good moderator. But do the other three panelists have sort of a closing point? This has been a fantastic discussion, really helpful to the commission, provocative questions from the audience and Nate, et cetera. But last thoughts, Derrick, Daphne, Renee, as we leave what was critical discussion for our country.
I'm not.
Derrick, you have to unmute.
Okay. Well, my closing statement, I've been listening to Nick. I think the administration should impanel a blue ribbon team of experts who can look at this from multiple perspectives, keep the lobby interests out of the room, and really come up with a comprehensive approach of how we could address the problem as it is being defined, whether it's existing tool, executive order, issues of national security, or legislation. I think that's going to be the most important part of it, because if we address 2 or 3 platforms, we miss another 500 platforms that exist or will be created overnight.
So I was about to talk, but I'm glad Derrick did first, because what he said is much smarter than what I was going to say. Like, I do think it is worth taking the time to get this right. And the only reason Europe is better at it right now is they've been practicing for years. You know, like, we can catch up, and we have great resources in terms of the technical expertise. Like, we can do a good job of this. And I hope reconcile it with the sense of urgency that people very, very rightly feel. But if we mess it up and we pass something that gets struck down by the very first court to review it, then we don't get this sort of magic that Jim pulled off before with everybody complying for a few years. So we need to be smart.
Yeah, I really appreciate the multi-stakeholder engagement on this issue and the various town halls that you've held. And, thanks for incorporating in the perspective of the work that we did in Election Integrity Partnership and that we're doing with Virality Project. I do feel that finding, creating those connections and the government using its convening power in particular to bring people together to have the conversation and to do it so publicly so that people don't feel that this is decisions that are being made without their input behind closed doors is really critical to thinking about where our, how we design the information ecosystem and preserve freedom of expression going forward.
This has been a fantastic discussion. Nate, thank you so much for moderating such really, really thoughtful opinions. The commission has a Google Doc form that allows the public to give feedback on this critical question that we're facing and that the country's facing. We urge you to do that. We urge you to continue to give us your thoughts and point of view so that when in a few months we put all this together and meet with the White House on it, that it'll be a coherent and thoughtful thing. But again, thank you so much to the 4 panelists for really, really thoughtful, helpful remarks, and Nate for doing such a good moderating job. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.